Good evening. I hope you're all doing well. Today we are learning Maseches Menachos. We're at the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Aleph. Just make sure you can hear. We're at the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Aleph at a new Mishnah, the beginning of which is easy, and as we progress into the Gemara, we'll get a little bit more sophisticated. And Mir Hashem, we'll get to the top of Nun Vav Amud Aleph, and then we'll pause there for the night. Says the Mishnah toward the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Aleph, 5 lines before the bottom of the page. Kol ha-menachos niloshos beposhrin. When you have a korban mincha that needs to be mixed with that needs to be made into a dough, so we use warm water. Now, there's a downside to warm water, which is that it makes things ferment a little bit faster. It makes things leaven a little bit more. This is, in fact, sometimes you find in ingredients, please put in very hot water with the flour. So here the Mishnah says that with menachos, niloshes, they are mixed with, losh is to mix or to stir, niloshes beposhrim, with warm water, but umeshamran shelo yachmitzu. While it's true that when you are doing the kmitza, you're allowed to use warm water, you have to make sure that the kmitza doesn't become chametz. That's not allowed at all. What if you already take the kmitza? What about the shirayim? Because remember, you added water to the flour. So the halacha is v'im hechmitzu. If in fact the shirayim did become chametz, you did add warm water, and all of a sudden we know our shiurim, it takes about 18 minutes for things to start to leaven. So the din is you violated an iser deoraisa. Im hechmitzu shiareha. If after the kmitza, so the kmitza you took before anything turned into chametz. But if the shiareha became chametz over below sase, you violate a lav in chumash. What's the lav in chumash? Shenemar kol ha-mincha asher takrivu laHashem lo se'aseh chametz. Every mincha that you bring before Hashem, you should not make into chametz. That's the drasha that the Mishnah quotes. And therefore, if one were in fact to have a shirayim that due to the warm water that was there, that it became chametz, the halacha is that you violated an isur doraisa. Fine. That is the Mishnah. Let's finish up the last line of the Mishnah. V'chayv al lishasa ve'al arichasa ve'al afyasa. If it ends up becoming chametz, so then every step, every individual step that you did is its own isur. The first isser would be lishasa. If you mix it with the warm water and it became chametz, then the mixing was an isser deoraisa. And as well, you'll be chayav on arichasa. Arichasa is shaping it and turning it into, whatever the shape you're making, matzah, and you're not making challah because it's menachos, but you're making a matzah shape. Va'al afyasa, that would also be an isser deoraisa if it were to have leavened. And that is the conclusion of the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Minahani Mili. How do we know these halachos? So says the Gemara as follows. The Gemara says, Amar Reish Lakish to Amar Kra, Lo se'afeh chametz chelkam, afilu chelkam, lo se'afeh chametz. How do we know, asks the Gemara, that we're talking about shirayim at all? That our Mishnah is talking about shirayim. The pasuk doesn't say that, so the Gemara says, because of the word chelkam in the Chumash, lo se'afeh chametz chelkam, you are not allowed to bake chametz. Really, there's a psik there in the pasuk, and chelkam is the next part of the pasuk. But the drasha is lo se'afeh chametz chelkam, afilu chelkam lo se'afeh chametz. Even a portion, not even if obviously the kmitza can't, but forget about the kmitza. Even the shirayim can't become chametz. Says the Gemara, that's not correct. The pasuk of Lo se'afeh chametz chelkam is already used for something else and for something more complex. Says the Gemara, Bahai lahachi u'da'asa, you're telling me that Reish Lakish is right, that the pasuk of Lo se'afeh chametz chelkam is coming to teach us that the shirayim that becomes chametz is an isser deoraisa? That can't be. Haimi boile lichidetanya. We actually need the pasuk of Lo se'afeh chametz for a brisa. This is a brisa that we have seen before. It looks familiar. Says the Gemara, Lo se'afeh chametz, turning to the top of Nun Hey Amud Beis, when the pasuk says that you should not make chametz, ma Talmud lomar. Why do I need the pasuk to say you're not allowed to bake chametz? After all, v'halo kvar ne'emar, we already have another pasuk that says, lo sa'aseh chametz. So we know that real estate in Chumash is pricey, and you're not allowed to have something that's duplicative in Chumash. So if we already had the pasuk of lo se'afeh chametz, why would we even ever bother having that if we already had the pasuk of lo sa'aseh chametz? So says the Gemara, lefish and emar lo sa'aseh chametz, when the Torah tells us that you're not allowed to be oseh chametz, yachol lo yehe chayev ela achas al kulam. You might have thought that unlike our Mishnah, where we said that you're chayev on the lisha, you're chayev on the aricha, and you're chayev on the afia, that every step that brings a mincha to the stage of chametz you'd be chayev on. I might have thought that if I only had the pasuk of lo sa'aseh chametz, I might have thought that lo yehe chayev ela al achas al kulam, that I would only be chayev one iser for all of the various steps of getting to that point of chametz. Talmud Lomar, says the Gemara, therefore we see lo se'afeh. That's why we have an extra pasuk of lo se'afeh. So says the Gemara, what does that even mean? Afia bichlal haisa. Afia is part of making chametz. So why would you have an extra pasuk? Lama yotzas. Why did you articulate of all of the different steps of making chametz? Why pick on afia? So says the Gemara, lehaki shaleha. We should have had enough information with lo se'aseh chametz. Why did the Torah bring out afia? So the Gemara says as follows: Ma afia miyuchedes, just like afia is unique in that shehi ma'ase yechidi v'chayav b'fnei atzma. I might have thought, says the Gemara, that by afia, which is the isolated thing that makes food into chametz, when you cook it, it can become chametz. Af ani avi lishasav arichasav v'chol ma'ase yechidi sheba. I'm also going to include any other step that leads to this korban mincha becoming chametz. So this is what the Gemara says is why we, in this brisa that we started at the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Aleph, the brisa indicates to us the reason why we have the pasuk of lo se'aseh chametz. And then the Torah goes out of its way to say lo se'afeh chametz. Why? To teach you that just like afia can bring something to the point of chametz, the other steps as well would be chayiv if you did them. The lisha, the mixing of water and flour, if it leads to chametz. The aricha, the shaping of it, if it leads to chametz. And of course, the baking as well. Now, the Gemara had used this line, "V'chol ma'aseh yechidi sheba," any individual act that a person does. So what is that even referring to? So the Gemara says that what's meant by this strange language of "v'chol ma'aseh yechidi," says the Gemara, "Li'isuye kituf shehu ma'aseh yechidi." Kituf is when a person takes water and they put it on top of a korban mincha. If that also plays a role in that korban mincha becoming chametz, so then you have an Isser D'Oraisa there as well. So this is what the Gemara's problem is. Let's just call out the question here. We started our Gemara today asking, how do we know that if the Shirayim become Chametz Yerchayev? We answered with the pasuk of Lo Se'afeh Chametz. Says the Gemara, you can't say that, because the Brisa, which is the first 10 lines of Nun Hey Amud Beis, says not like that. The Brisa on the top of Nun Hey Amud Beis says we need both psukim. We need lo sa'aseh chametz and we need lo se'afeh chametz. What do we learn from both of these psukim? So the Gemara says, I might have thought if I only had lo sa'aseh chametz that only afia would lead to the isser of making chametz, but the other steps would not. But no, now that the Torah went out of its way to speak about afia, we make a hekesh from afia, that just like afia can generate chametz, so too the steps that lead up to it, lisha, aricha, and of course afia, and then of course we add in this unique one of kituf as well. So now the Gemara says to Reish Lakish, sorry, you don't have a marmakum anymore. The marmakum that you tried to use on the bottom to say, why do we know that it's going to be an Isser D'Oraisa if the Shirayim becomes Asr Lo Se'afeh Chametz? No, that pasuk is unavailable. That pasuk is used to teach us that every step becomes Chayev as well. It's not just about the Shirayim. So the Gemara responds and defends Reish Lakish as follows. We're about 10 lines down, right across from Tosfos Im Kain. The Gemara says, Anan me chelkam ka'amrinan. No. I'm not learning from the words lo se'afeh chametz, says Reish Lakish. I'm learning from the word chelkam. You're right. I I quoted the whole pasuk. The Gemara wanted to know, how do we know that shirayim that become chametz is an isur d'oraisa? The Gemara said lo se'afeh chametz chelkam. The Gemara said, wait, you can't say lo se'afeh chametz because it's used already. How does Reish Lakish respond? Of course it's used already. I'm not learning from lo se'afeh chametz. I'm learning from the last word that was quoted, which is the word chelkam. Anan me chelkam ka'amrinan. So says the Gemara, Be'ema, perhaps we should say, if that's true, that we're learning from the word chelkam, maybe we should say, Kule lahachi hu de'asa. Maybe that pasuk is only about the sheets of Reish Lakish, and maybe we can't learn anything about the Lisha and the Aricha. It's another way to learn the pasuk. Maybe all of it is to teach exactly what Reish Lakish wanted to say, and not like the Brisa. Says the Gemara, no. Im Kain, had it been that that were to be the case, that really Reish Lakish was the only show in town, and the pasuk of Lo Se'afeh Chametz Chelkam was not teaching us about the specificity of each step that you're going to be chayiv, but only to teach us that if the shirayim become chametz, you're going to be chayiv. Im Kain, Lichtov Chelkam Lo Se'afeh Chametz. Then it would have been, the pasuk would have been reversed. My Lo Se'afeh Chametz Chelkam Shamas Minotarte. We can learn out both things. We can learn out din number 1 from the word chelkam that teaches us, like Reish Lakish taught us at the open of the Gemara and the bottom of the Nehamid Aleph, that if the shirayim become chametz, you're chayiv. And then you can look at the other part of the pasuk of Lo Se'afeh Chametz from the Brisa that teaches us that each step that leads to chametz is going to be problematic. This is reminiscent of a halach in Hilchos Shabbos that echad mevi esa eitzim ve'echad mevi esa. This is a famous Gemara. I can't remember the whole text, but the Gemara there says that if one person brings the wood, and one person brings the fire, and one person brings the food, everyone's chayav. Everyone who played a role. The same thing is true here. So says the Gemara, about a fifth of the way down, ve'ema, perhaps we should say, look, afia de parat ba rachman lechayev chada, inach lechayev chada akulu. Says the Gemara, a lumdish question. I don't understand. The Torah says lo se'afeh chametz. So what should I assume? I should assume that afia, that baking something into chametz, is where the isur deoraisa is. But perhaps, says the Gemara, that would not be true by the other aspects of making this chametz. But inach, the other steps, namely the lisha and the aricha, and let's say the kituf, lechayev chad akulu. Perhaps if I did all of those, I'd only be chayev one. After all, just look at the pasuk. The pasuk says lo se'afeh chametz. It doesn't say lo tilosh chametz. It doesn't say lo ta'arich chametz. It's clear. Why don't we just take the pasuk at face value? The pasuk says exactly what it means to say. Don't bake it into chametz. So mehechatesi, that you should learn the brisa the way that you did, to say that even only the lisha is going to be chayiv, and even only the aricha is going to be no. Maybe it's only the afia, but all the other steps that would lead to this becoming chametz, perhaps they'd all be one iser. So the Gemara says, Mishum dehava davar shahaya bichlal. Really, we didn't need to have the word afia at all, because it should have been included in the larger category, the larger pasuk of lo se'aseh chametz. V'yatza min haklal l'lamed. And we did show an example of more detail in the pasuk, which is lo se'afeh chametz. And lo l'lamed al atzmo yatza, pasha that lo se'afeh chametz wasn't there to only teach about itself. Elo l'lamed al klal kulo yatza. It had to be that it was talking about something bigger. And therefore, says the Gemara, just like afia would be aser, since it's lo ba l'lamed al atzmo elo l'lamed al klal kulo yatza, since the Torah went out of its way to say lo se'afeh, even if it already had lo se'aseh chametz, and then we still said lo se'afeh, it must be that it's teaching us a general rule. And what's that general rule? That every step along the way, lisha, aricha, kituf, afia, if they lead to building a korban mincha into chametz, the halacha is that each one is an isur daraisa of its own accord. Says the Gemara, a third of the way down, ve'ema, maybe we should learn this pasuk a little bit different. Maybe one pasuk is lo se'aseh klal. When the Torah says don't make chametz, it doesn't say don't bake chametz. It says don't make chametz. That's a klal. That's a very general, broad term. And then when it says lo se'afeh chametz, that's a very specific way to cook, right? So therefore, that's a prat. And perhaps we have klal uprat and ein bichlal ela mashe beprat. Maybe we should learn that lo se'aseh is a klal, lo se'afeh is a prat, and we have a case of klal uprat. And what is common about the prat? And ein bichlal ela mashe beprat afia in. The only time there's an iser deoraisa of making a korban mincha into chametz is when you do baking, but midi achrina lo. But it would never be the case by midi achrina by any other step along the way. So according to this approach, if we assume that there's a klal uprat, that lo se'aseh is the klal, lo se'afeh is the prat, so then it would turn out, if we had a klal uprat, that only afia would be the iser deoraisa, lisha would not be, aricha would not be, and kituf would not be. So says the Gemara, hold on one second. Amar Rav Apturiki. What does Rav Apturiki say? Mishum dehave klalu pratim meruchakim zemizeh. No, these two psukim are very, very far from one another. One pasuk says, lo se'aseh chametz. That's in Vayikra Perek Beis. And then 4 prakim later in Vayikra Vav, it says, lo se'afeh. You want to say we have a klalu prat, but the klal is in Perek Beis, and the prat is 4 prakim later in Perek Vav? No dice. That does not work. V'chol klalu prat ha'meruchakim zemizeh ein dananosan b'klalu prat. Says the Gemara, your havamina that perhaps we should say lo se'aseh is a klal and lo se'afeh is a prat doesn't work because they're too far apart. Normally, when we say klalu pradu klal, it's all within one pasuk. Forget about one perek. Here, the example that the Gemara gave as a question was, oh, we have a klal uprat. Vayikra perek beis is the klal lo se'aseh. And 4 parakim later, let's say, 100 psukim later, all of a sudden, the prat shows up. So says the Gemara in the name of Rabbi Apturiki that no. When you have a klal uprat that are meruchakim zemizeh, the halacha is ein dananosan b'klal uprat. He says that does not fly. Says the Gemara, are you sure? Masi Rav Ada bar Ava. Rav Ada bar Ava brings a brisa. Ve'amrei la kedi. Some say that the person who brought the brisa was kedi. As we've seen many times in Shas, kedi is either the name of an Amora, or kedi basically means anonymous and we don't know who it is. One way or the other, a question was posed against Rav Apturiki's Havamina that ein dananosan b'chlalu prat, that we don't have klalu prat, when there's a huge gap between the klal and the prat, like our case, where they're 4 prakim apart. Let's see the case of Rav Ada bar Ava or the case of Kedi. Says the Gemara, uklalu prat meruchakim zemizeh. You want to say that if you have a klal and a prat that are far away, ein dananosan b'chlalu prat? You want to say that there is no link between the two? I disagree with you, and I'll show you why. This is a complex piece of Gemara. Let's learn this piece together. V'atanya, we're halfway down on Nun Hey Amud Beis. We have a brisa. The pasuk says, and where is this pasuk over here? It's in Vayikra Perek Daled. The pasuk says, is that the right pasuk? V'shachat oso. The pasuk says, V'shachat oso b'mkom asher yishchat es ha'ola. Now here, we are actually talking about the chatas of a nasi. And if a nasi makes a mistake, he has to bring a chatas. So the pasuk says about the seir of the chatas, the seir of the nasi, that when it's shechted, it's b'makom asher yishchat es ha'olah lifnei Hashem chatasu. It has to be shechted in the same place where the ola is shechted. Hechan ola nishchetes. And where is it that the ola is shechted? So says the Gemara, bitzafon, it's shechted in the north. So to our case of the seir of the nasi, the chatas of a nasi, that's also going to be shechted in the north. So we see from the brisa that we learn the halacha that the seir of the nasi is shechted in the north from the pasuk and its comparison to an ola. Says the Gemara, that's just not where we learn it from. V'chi anu mikan lamedin. Do we learn from there that that's the case? No. V'halo kvar ne'emar b'makom asher tishchat ha'olah tishchat ha'chatas. We have another pasuk that has a very similar message, that in the place where we shecht an olah, that's where the chatas should be. So we have one pasuk that we just learned in Vayikra Vav, pasuk Yud Ches, And then our first pasuk that we brought at the beginning of this brisa was Vayikra Dalid, Perek Chav Dalid. So halama zeh yotza. So why is it that we have an extra pasuk? Says the Gemara, Lekovo she'im lo shachato. So b'tzafon paslo, we have an extra pasuk to teach us that if you take this seir chatas and you shecht it not in the north, the halacha is that it's pasal. Says the Gemara, Ata Omer Lakach Yotzas. You want to say that's why we have two psukim? O eno elo shezet taon safon ve'en acher taon safon. Perhaps it's only to teach us that the seir chatas has a unique din, that it's done in the north, but other chatos are not done in the north. Talmud Lomar, I disagree. No. V'shachates hachatos bimkom ha'ola. Ze bona av l'chol chataos shetu'unin safon. We have a binyan av from the pasuk of v'shachates hachatos b'makom ha'ola that all chatos, even the chatos of the seir of the nasi, should be done in the north, and it's a binyan av about all chatos that they need to be done in the north. Now let's put on our thinking caps. Says the Gemara, Taima, the reason why, let me just find my notes here. The reason why we assume that this is the case is because of Rachmana v'shachat es hachatos. The reason why we assume that the seir chatos should be done in the north is because it says v'shachat es hachatos. Halav hachi. Without that part of the pasuk, what would I have understood? The pasuk itself is the only reason I would assume that it's going to be done in the north. And my taima, why would I assume that? Now we're going to connect back to what we learned earlier. Lav mishum dahava klalu prat. Isn't that because we have these two psukim that are a klalu prat? The pasuk in Vayikra Dalid that says v'shachata so b'makom kadosh, and the pasuk in Vayikra Vav that also says that b'makom asher tishchata lo tishchata chatos. So Rashi points this out as well. Rashi halfway down says klalu prat. Tishachet hachatas klal and kol chatos b'tzafon v'shachatos so prat seir nasi v'lo acher. So what do we see? We have a klalu prat. The afal gav that this klalu prat are distant from one another. The afal gav the meruchakin zemizeh donano so beklalu prat. The Gemara shows that yes, it's okay to do a klalu prat uklal if it's not the same pasuk, even if it's not the same perek. We thought from the Gemara. We asked a question earlier. We said that maybe there's klalu pradu klal. Maybe when it comes to lo se'afecha meitz and lo se'asecha meitz, that there's klalu prat. If it's klalu prat, so then perhaps the only time there's an isser is by afia when you make a mincha into chametz, but not any other step, not the lisha, not the aricha. So the Gemara says, no, you can't have a klalu prat that are meruchakim zemizeh. What we see in this brisa about the din of a seir chatas is that, yes, you can. We can have a scenario where the we can have a scenario where there's a klal in one perek and a prat in another perek. So says the Gemara, okay, I hear you, but you've made an error. Because really, it's not a klal uprat. Really, it's a prat uklal. The psukim are in the reverse order. Maskef lo Ravashi. Hi, klal uprat hu? Absolutely not. It's not a klal uprat, but it's a prat uklalhu. V'nase klal mosif ala prat, v'israbi lahu kol mili. If you have a klal uprat, it limits what's usher. If you have a prat uklal, it adds in what's usher. They're totally opposite direction limudim. But the problem is that you're trying to bring a proof from Vayikra Dalad Chav Dalad to Vayikra Vav Yud Ches that we say you're allowed to have a klal uprat that's meruchakim zemizeh. Yeah, that would be great, but the order of the psukim is not klal uprat. The prat is first. And if it's prat uklal, then of course there are going to be other isurim because prat uklal has a broader inclusion of isur. So says the Gemara, I got you, I totally understand. Elatana, what was bothering the Tana from above, that we were learning at the top of the page? Really what he was concerned about was oso, kakashale, that the word oso is an exclusionary word. And therefore, v'achi kamar, o eno elo shezet ton safon, vein achar ton safon. Maybe the brisa that we learned about the location of the seir nasi is simply that the word oso is an exclusionary word. And you might have thought, oh, eno elo shezet ton safon, vein achar ton safon. Maybe because it says oso by the seir nasi, that only that one needs to be in the tzafon, but all other chatos should not be done in the tzafon. The cost of rachmana oso. So that is how the Gemara assumes that we understand that brisa that speaks about our case of the Seir Nasi. And says the Gemara, "V'hashta the nafkale mi v'shachat esachatas oso le'meutemai." But lemaisa that we learned it from v'shachat esachatas. What do we do with the word oso? So this is going to be subject to 5 possible answers. We're only going to do one right now, maybe 2. I think only one though. Let's see. So says the Gemara, Osa lemeute mai. Lemeute, what it's going to do is give us one of 5 answers. Nachshon v'shachat of pesach simin. Says the Gemara, Oso b'tzafon ve'ein sir nachshon b'tzafon. Yeah, you're right. The word oso does teach us something exclusionary. It excludes for us that the seir nachshon does not get done in the north. What's the seir nachshon? That was when the 12 Nesiim brought the korbanos in Parshas Naso. And all of the korbanos are exactly the same. Korbano, karas kesef, achas. All the psukim are exactly the same. 12 times over. All the Moser, why did the Torah repeat itself? Everyone's a yachid, fine. So says the Gemara, is that when we have the word oso by the Seir Nasi, the exclusion that's taking place over there is that it means there we have an obligation to do it in the north by the Seir Nasi, that Chatas does, but the Chatas of the Seir Nachshon, which was a, Lefi Shah, that was only done once, that is not done b'tzafon. That can be done even in the south. And Sal Kadaita Chamina, I might have thought that Hol v'is Rabbi le'inyan smicha, lis Rabbi nami le'inyan safon. I might have thought that since the Seir Nachshon does have smicha, that there might be a link between smicha and doing it b'tzafon. Kamash Malan, that's not true. That even though by the Seir Nachshon there is a din of smicha, we do not say that because there's a din of smicha, that therefore there's also a din of doing the Seir Nachshon b'tzafon. Kamash Malan, that's not the case. Usmicha gufa minalan. How do we know that there's a din of smicha by the Seir Nachshon? So says the Gemara 2 lines from the bottom. Usmicha gufa minalan detanya. This brisa is a brisa in Zvachim, a little bit in the middle of the Masechta, about 100 blot ago. The Gemara says, "V'samach yado al rosh hasoir." We didn't need to say hasoir. You can just say "V'samach yado al rosho." What does the extra word hasoir teach us? Last line of Nun Hamud Beis. L'rabo seir nachshon l'smicha dibur Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is clearly of the opinion that based on the pasuk of hasair, that we include with seir nachshon, that does not need to be shechted in the tzafon, but afal pikein, it does need to have smicha. That's a sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. However, Reb Shimon Omer lerabo seirei avodas kochavim lesmicha. He says that no. What does the word seir teach us? It's not to include smicha by seirei nachshon, but rather to include smicha by seirei avodas kochavim lesmicha. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. Maskif lo Ravina, Teinach le Rabbi Yehuda. I understand the Havamina according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the riboy of hasair teaches me that smicha is required by seir nachshon. So therefore, I might have had a Havamina that just like there's smicha by seir nachshon, there's also going to be tzafon, a din of tzafon by seir nachshon. Kamash Milan, that's not true. I could understand that. But the Reb Shimon, who holds that hasair doesn't teach me about smicha by the seir nachshon, but rather by the seirei avodas kochavim. So then what's the Havamina Bichlal that the Seir Nachshon would ever have been in the north? Our Gemara presented it as, could be because of smicha. Reb Shimon holds that there's no way that there's smicha by the Seir Nachshon because HaSa'ir only teaches us that there's a riboy of smicha by a different korban, not Seir Nachshon, but rather Seirei Vodas Kochavim. So says the Gemara, Omar Leimar Zutra Berei Rav Mari Ravina, Rabbi Yehuda Nami. What kind of question is that? Even according to Rabbi Yehuda said, I learned the drush of Hasair that teaches me that there's smicha by Seir Nachshon. What does that have to do with whether or not the shechita is done in the north? Ma'idi Israbi, Ma'idi lo Israbi. I don't understand. We were bothered by the fact that Reb Shimon said that Hasair doesn't teach us about Seir Nachshon. Seir Nachshon doesn't have a din of smicha. So how could you say that there's going to be a din in the north if there's no concern of smicha? Forget that. Rabbi Yehuda yourself, you say that there's a din of smicha by the Seirei Nachshon. What does that have to do with whether or not the shechita is done b'tzafon? There's no connection. Ma'idi Israbi Israbi. The fact that the Seir Nachshon, according to Rabbi Yehuda, has a din of smicha, good gevaldik. What does that have to do with whether or not it's done b'tzafon? So even according to Rabbi Yehuda, we don't understand the Havamin of the Gemara. V'chi tema, says the Gemara, ilo me'ate kra Havamina teisi b'binyanav. If you want to say that without the Torah's exclusion, I might have thought that I could have learned it b'binyanav. Smicha gufa lishto kramine b'teisi b'binyanav. Then we wouldn't have needed the word smicha to be spoken about in the psukim at all. I could have learned it some other way. Ella, says the Gemara, you're right. Sha'a midoros lo yalfinan. In general, we don't look at a momentary korban, namely in our case, the seirei nachshon, which were only done by the Chanukah Samizbeach. We don't learn from there to doros, to korbanos that are brought long term. And hachanami, in our case, that's going to be the same principle that hachanami shami doros lo yalfinan. So therefore, there's no havamina by the seirei nachshon at all that it would need to be done in the north. So that's answer number one. Let's learn one more answer together. I was planning on stopping here, but we have a little bit more time. Ella, says the Gemara. Remember, what we're trying to answer is, what does the word oso do for us? And if you want to look back, the question starts toward the bottom of the page, where we see on the second of the wide lines on the bottom of Nun Hamid Beis. We wanted to know that Hashta denafgale mishachad. What do the words oso teach us? So here's answer number two. Limeute ela oso ta'un safon ve'ein hashochet omed b'safon. Maybe it means that yes, the seirei nasi have to be in the north, but the shochet doesn't have to be in the north. I can stand on the south and use a long blade, no problem at all. But the animal has to be there. I just don't have to be there. And says the Gemara, that is mid Rabbi Achia nafka. We learned that already. The Tanya, Rabbi Achia Omer, v'shachatos so al yerach hamizbeach tzafona ma Talmud lomar. What does it mean that when you shecht it has to be on the north? Lefi shematzina b'mekabel she'omed b'tzafon u'mekabel b'tzafon. That you have to stand there. V'imamad b'dar v'kibel b'tzafon pasol yachol af zekain. Maybe the same is true by shchita. Talmud lomar oso. Oso b'tzafon v'lo hashochet tzarach lios omed b'tzafon. I don't need you to stand there. All right, fine. Let's learn a little bit more. Says the Gemara, Ella, let's try a third answer. Maybe oso b'tzafon teaches us that when it comes to this animal we need it, but ve'ein of b'tzafon, that maybe birds don't need to be b'tzafon. Sal kadai tachamini leisi b'kal v'chomer mi ben son. Maybe I could have learned it from sheep, from smaller animals. Uma ben son shelo kavalo kohen kavalo tzafon. That when it comes to a ben son, that the shechita does not need to be done by a kohen, but it needs to be in the north. But a ben ov shekavala kohen, a bird where the malika, the way we kill it with a nail, can only be done in the north. Can only be done by a kohen. Eino din shenikba lo tzafon. Shouldn't it be that we assume that, of course, it's in the north? Says the Gemara, you can't learn that way because malik ben son shekain kavalo kli. No, the Kabbalah Saddam applies by a ben son, that you have to collect the blood that way, but it doesn't apply by a bird. Okay, we'll stop right here at the fourth answer of Ella Osa B'Tzafon in the middle of Nun Vav Amud Aleph. We'll stop right here. Im Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll come back together again tomorrow night for another night of learning, and then we're off on Wednesday. Please learn that blot on your own, and we'll stop right here. Wishing you all a beautiful night.